Well, hello everybody. Welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another episode of what I hope is your favorite public affairs programming. Thank you for tuning in today. Just want to also let you know that all of our episodes, our past episodes, can be found on Facebook, facebook.com/NorthStarOasis, and eventually we'll be getting them back up onto our YouTube channel, youtube.com/NorthStarOasis. We hope you continue to join us, and we are in the middle of a series right now, and our Facebook page does have the previous 3 episodes, and soon they will also have this one, the 4th episode. We're going to, as we do every week, we go to a Prager University segment. I want to encourage you to check out the Prager University website, prageruniversity.com. They have a lot of great material there, including on their YouTube channel, which is where we get most of the stuff that we show you. But today's Prager University segment is, where are the moderate Muslims? It's a very good question. Where are they? I keep hearing about them. Do they even exist? Let's find out. Let's see what Prager University has to say.
After every new jihadist attack against the West, politicians reassure us that the atrocity does not represent the true nature of mainstream Islam. Of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, they constantly reassure us the overwhelming majority are as law-abiding as any members of any other monotheistic faith. Only a tiny fraction engage in terror, and Islam is a religion of peace. Furthermore, we are told the great majority of Muslims hold moderate views. But what does that mean? How moderate are moderate Muslims? Given the threat of radical Islam, it would seem to be a fair question. Let me start to answer it by telling you something of my own story. I was raised in a middle-class Muslim home in Cairo, Egypt. Growing up, I was told, among many other things, the following: that every day that passes on the Islamic nation without a caliphate is a sin, that the failures and miseries of the Muslim world started the moment we Muslims gave up conquests and wars against the infidels, that our prosperity depended on conquering new lands and converting new believers, that anyone who leaves the faith must die. And I also remember how my teachers and my mosque imams reacted to the news of 9/11 when it happened. Joy. My experience was typical, and there is data to prove it. According to the Pew Research Center, 88% of Muslims in Egypt, 62% in Pakistan, 86% in Jordan, and 51% in Nigeria believe that any Muslim who chooses to leave Islam should be put to death. Similar, if not identical numbers, are in favor of stoning people who commit adultery, severely punishing those who criticize Mohammad or Islam, and chopping off hands for theft. All of these practices are a part of the penal code of Islamic law, which is known as Sharia. And 84% of Muslims in South Asia, 77% in Southeast Asia, 74% in the Middle East and North Africa, and 64% in Sub-Saharan Africa support Sharia as the law of the land. Less drastic, yet significant percentages are to be found even among Muslim communities in the West. So too, most of the world's Muslims believe that any acts of violence against Israel, including suicide bombers in buses and restaurants, are justified. Now, does any of this sound moderate to you? Yet, if anyone raises these inconvenient truths here in the West, he is sure to be called an Islamophobe, a hater of Islam. Again, my own story is instructive. In February of 2015, I was yelled at, cursed at, and successfully prevented from speaking at Swarthmore College by students and others who did not agree to what I was saying. Some of them were Muslim women who fit the image of the unveiled, perfect English-speaking moderate Muslim young woman. Other seeming moderates tried and failed to do the same during my speech at Temple University the next day. Some of them, sadly, were students of journalism. It is not Islamophobic to note the tragic fact that at this time in history, the Muslim world is dominated by bad ideas and bad beliefs. That is why millions of so-called moderate Muslims do not rise up to denounce Islamic terror. Because the word moderate, as we understand it, does not really apply. If moderation means you tolerate freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, women's rights, and gay rights, moderate Muslims are a distinct minority. Of course they exist, millions of them, but among believing Muslims, they do not represent anywhere near a critical mass. The values of the West and the values of Islam, as practiced in the Muslim worlds of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, and more in Europe, are not compatible. Western politicians can deny this, but this denial does not change the reality. It is these bad ideas and beliefs that provides the soil in which radical Islam grows. Ignoring this only prevents us from effectively fighting Islamist terror, and at the same time, it hurts those heroic Muslims who really are moderate. Until we begin to tell the truth about Islam, always in respectful language, the only solution to Islamist terror will never take place. That solution is Islam reforming itself. I do believe that reform is possible. It can, of course, only be done from within Islam. The West can be a part of that reform, but only if it faces and tells the truth. The sooner it does so, the better for all of us. I am Hussein Abu Bakr for Prager University.
So, there you have it. We need to be able to discuss this respectfully. Let's go and take a look at our previous weeks of what we've covered for this series, because we're in the middle of a long series right now. I don't even know when the series is going to end, to be truthful, because I'm still developing it. This originally was just supposed to be a one-episode wonder, and that was on April 7th. And we discussed the Kurdish independence movement from 1975, the American hostage crisis in Iran from 1979 to 1981, and how that led to the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 88. And I forgot to put on the slide the chemical bombing in Halabja in 1988, but that was kind of part of the Iran-Iraq War. And then we ended that one with Iraq invades Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. So that was our first part of the series. And it was after that that I realized we were doing a series because I had way more content than I knew what to do with. So April 14th, we came in and discussed Iraq invading Kuwait, which is where we left off part one. We covered Desert Shield, Desert Storm in 1990 and 91, then Desert Fox and Desert Thunder in the mid-90s under the Bill Clinton administration. And then we covered the Clinton administration's pushing for the Iraq Liberation Act, which changed the scope of U.S. foreign policy from one of containment against the Iraqi government to one of regime change. And then we finished that with the September 11th attack, and then we briefly got into Operation Enduring Freedom. Last week, part 3, we discussed more about the September 11th, 2001 attack, and then we covered Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and their list of demands, along with fighting in Tora Bora cave complex and the attempt at capturing bin Laden in December of 2001. And then we finished with a brief discussion of rare earth elements that are discovered in Afghanistan, showing the importance of the mountain region in geopolitical affairs. So that's where we're at so far. So as we go into part 4, we are going to be discussing more about the history of Afghanistan up until 1978. Yes, I know this is a boring topic. I understand that. Please bear with me. And the reason is, this is important stuff. If it wasn't important, believe me, I wouldn't be talking about it. Unfortunately, I have more of notes that I've read, I've written. I'll tell you this, I spent a lot of time this week, a lot of time, picking this stuff apart. Because there's a lot of stuff here I didn't even know. But I was amazed as I was peeling back the layers of what was going on, how Afghanistan came to be. And that's what I'm going to be spending more time sharing with you today. So we're going to really, if I look down and read notes, I'm going to apologize. Normally this stuff is stuck in my head. This time, I don't even trust myself to go off the top of my head because I'm really not well versed with the complexities of this. This is why I got to rely on notes today. We're going to start off in 1747. That was even before the American Revolution. Now, don't worry, we're not going to spend a lot of time there. We're going to cover a great bit of history in a short amount of time. So I'm going to try to just give you some of the more important parts. I'm not going to go back to antiquity in 563 BC. I'm not going to go there. But we are going to kind of start this discussion in 1747 with a man named Ahmad Shah Durrani. He's the one who had really united a lot of the tribes in what we now know as Afghanistan, and he established his kingdom, so to speak, at Kandahar. And if you've paid any attention to Operation Enduring Freedom and our operations in Afghanistan, Kandahar comes back quite a bit, and it's going to be part of the history. Kandahar and Kabul are the two major cities in Afghanistan we're really going to spend some time talking about. The Durrani Empire started in 1747. It was comprised of the land encompassing modern-day Afghanistan, northeastern Iran, eastern Turkmenistan, most of Pakistan, and northwestern India, including Kashmir. Now, there's been a lot of stuff, and we'll take this apart on a future episode about Kashmir. Kashmir is its own I hate to say enemy. It just so happens that there's a lot of stuff that goes on there. I don't have time today to really unpeel that onion. The land, kind of, if you know anything about this area, and unfortunately I don't really have a good map to show you, the land stretched from Khorasan in the west, Kashmir and Delhi in the east, and the Amu River, known as Amu Darya, in the north. That possibly might even be, if you know your biblical history, the Gihon River of Genesis when they were discussing the Garden of Eden. There's a possibility the Arabic name for that actually comes from the Aramaic word of Gihon. So there's a possibility of a connection there. And then the Arabian or Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf is the border in the south. That was the large territory that encompassed Afghanistan. And then they've had wars with India, China, other Pashtuns, because a lot of this is the Pashtun ethnicity. And that really defined the next 80 years of Afghanistan history, Durrani Empire history. So we're going to take a look right now a little bit more at Ahmad Shah, who was the founder of the Durrani Empire.
Ahmad Shah Durrani was born in 1747 as Ahmad Khan Abdali. He is known by Afghans to be the founder of modern-day Afghanistan. He was born in Herat, an area which his tribe, the Abdali Pashtuns, inhabited. At a young age, Ahmad Khan's father and grandfather were both killed in a battle, forcing him to flee to Kandahar, where he lived under the Khilzais. In Kandahar, he was taken prisoner under Shah Hussain. However, he was later to be enlisted in Nadir Afshar's army. Whilst in Nadir Afshar's army, he was to be part of the army that took over Kandahar. This eventually saw the rule of the Khilzais come to an end, and the Abdalis being more prominent in the region. Nadir Afshar had a favor towards Ahmad Khan and freed him, providing him work as a government official. He was eventually assassinated, and the Abdalis, who were loyal to the leader Nadir Afshar, returned to Kandahar to seize control. Ahmad Khan was unanimously the Emir, giving him the title Ahmad Shah. He started a reign of military conquest, and in 1748 he took over the modern-day Pakistan city of Lahore. He did not stop there, and in 1749 the Mughal ruler of the time yielded most of the Punjab and the vital parts of the Indus River to Ahmad Shah, in order to not have his armies invaded by the forces of Ahmad Shah. Not being emir for long, he continued his military campaigns to take over modern-day Afghanistan. He first conquered Ghazni and followed on to take over Herat from the Persians in 1750. Ahmad Shah Durrani invaded the Indian regions 8 times, plundering and conquering armies in his path. He was obsessed with maintaining control of the region. His 8th invasion saw him facing defeat at the hands of 20,000 Sikh forces. He eventually returned to Afghanistan and was still military active. However, by 1773 he was battling cancer which had stricken his face. He eventually died in 1773 at the age of 50. His son Timur Shah succeeded him, and the Durrani Empire remained till its last Emir Shah Shuja Durrani. Ahmad Khan Abdali is known for being the founding father of modern-day Afghanistan and creating the largest Islamic empire in the second half of the 18th century. His shrine is now located in Kandahar, the place of his passing.
Now, I know that he spoke a little bit fast. I get that. And so that's just to give you a little bit of how revered that Ahmad Shah Durrani is still in Afghanistan, as he is considered the father of modern Afghanistan, or father of Afghanistan. And I guess we do have a map that we're going to show of Afghanistan. Am I correct? Okay. Because if you understand the Durrani Empire, and there we have the modern map of Afghanistan. If you take a look to the right underneath the globe, so in the top left corner, that's Turkmenistan, and that is that area of Turkmenistan, eastern Turkmenistan, was part of the Durrani Empire. Most of Pakistan, which is to your right, that encompassed the empire. Northwestern India, which you really can't see too well. I don't even think we can see that on the map. Yeah, that's further on the right. Yeah, there it is, up towards the top right. That part was also part of the Durrani Empire, and that includes Kashmir. And then, as we see, Khorasan to the west, Kashmir and Delhi to the east, and then the Amu Darya on the north. And I know you really can't see too well, but if we can see the cursor right where it says Pakistan and there's a river, yeah, right there, that's the Amu Darya, and that's the northern border. So, and then it stretches further south originally all the way to the Persian Gulf / Arabian Sea, depending on your viewpoint. So that was the Durrani Empire, but we're going to take a look now at one man named Dost Muhammad Khan. What was the United States doing in 1793? George Washington was president then. And Dost Muhammad Khan, he was born in Kandahar. By 1809, so Thomas Jefferson, roughly, James Madison, presidential terms. Dost Muhammad Khan's brother was the chief of the Barakzai tribe, and he helped Muhammad Shah Durrani to the head of the dynasty. Now, Muhammad Shah Durrani is one of Ahmad Shah Durrani's kids, one of his sons. And then 8 years later, Mahmud Shah Durrani had that same brother, Fateh Khan, assassinated. Boy, some thanks. You helped me to power, and then I'm going to assassinate you. By 1823, the Durrani Empire was no more. Because of that act of assassination, Muhammad Shah Durrani was then vanquished by the Barakzai tribe, and that was in 1818. And then his kingdom was split among Fateh Khan's brothers, and Dost Muhammad Khan received Ghazni, and then he added Kabul in 1826, and he was named the Emir, or the Lord or Chief or King of the province of Kabul. Dost Muhammad Khan, he was the founder of the Barakzai dynasty, and he had 25 wives, 27 sons, and 25 daughters. And that's quite a lineage. So here we're dealing already with tribal conflict in Afghanistan. We have one dynasty that's no more. We have another dynasty that's beginning. And then guess what happens? The British and the Russians start playing their geopolitical game in the region. In the United States, we had our own problems to worry about. You know, in the 1820s, we had finished another war with England, the War of 1812, and we were not quite in the war with Mexico. We were still trying to figure out how to govern ourselves, much less get into anybody else's affairs. And we were still pretty much living under George Washington's decree of staying out of foreign entanglements. And Britain, of course, they had an empire. The sun never set in the British Empire. They continued their conquest worldwide, and that included Afghanistan. As far as Russia is concerned, they had been trying to establish a trade route from Moscow down to India as early as 1557. And yet, because Afghanistan, as we call it, is the graveyard of empires, they still had a hard time penetrating that particular region. Now, they did, by 1824, occupy the Kazakh Khanate, which we now know as Kazakhstan. That part, they had a strong foothold, but in 1824, they did not conquer what we now know as Afghanistan. And Dost Muhammad Khan was pretty much becoming the king of that Afghanistan territory. And then we had Britain entering the fray. In 1830, January 12th, Britain had already feared that Persia, modern Iran, and Turkey, as we know in modern parlance, that they would become protectorates of Russia. That's what they were fearing. And Russia's always been one to want to create buffer states, buffer zones against its own natural borders. And so they established what has later been given the connotation of the Great Game. And it was established by the series of buffer states stretching from the Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, up to India, and then up the Indus and Sutlej rivers. And then they used sea power to protect shipping lanes through Central Asia and into China. That was what the British government was looking for. So, of course, when you're dealing with Dost Muhammad Khan in Afghanistan, he's trying to build his own empire. He's trying to keep everything together. He's trying to recapture the Kashmir region and then the Peshawar region. In 1837, Dost Muhammad Khan was trying to recover the Peshawar region. First, he tried an alliance with Britain, but he was unable to gain favor from Lord Auckland, who was the British Governor General of British India. And remember, what we now know as Pakistan today used to be part of India, and that part of India was all controlled by the British. And later on, Mohandas Gandhi led the Indian independence movement, but this was about 100 years before Gandhi's time. So then, of course, the British, not able to control Khan, they had exiled him, Dost Muhammad Khan, to Missouri, India. And then they had instituted Shah Shuja as Dost Muhammad Khan's replacement. And then in 1842, Shah Shuja was assassinated, and then Dost Muhammad Khan was restored back to rule. And he continued to seek territorial expansion from 1842 through 1857. And he, with the help of the British, declared war on Persia. And then he led his warriors to battle on May 26, 1863 to recapture Herat. but then he died suddenly on June 9th, 1863. And what was going on in the United States at the time? We had finished the Chancellorsville campaign in the beginning of May of 1863, and both the Army of the Potomac and Army of Northern Virginia were in the Fredericksburg area. And then by June 9th, that was around the time of the Battle of Brandy Station. Brandy Station, I think, may have occurred a little bit after that, but that's the general vicinity. It wasn't until the beginning of June, roughly around June 9th, I think it may have been June 12th or 14th, when the armies in Virginia were on the move to Gettysburg. So that was going on at the time that Dost Muhammad Khan was seeking his territorial ambitions in Afghanistan, and was died after the battle to recapture Herat. And then one of the big quotes from Dost Muhammad Khan, one of his famous quotes was, "We have man, and we have gold and treasure and sacred land in plenty. We have everything." He was replaced by his son, Sher Ali Khan, and he was overthrown by a brother in 1866, but then he overthrew his brother after an exile in Russia in 1868, and then new conflicts with Britain began. And then they marched into Afghanistan even later on November 21st, 1878, forced him back to exile in Russia, but he died the next year or a couple months later in Mazar-e-Sharif in Afghanistan. So another series of conflicts between Britain and the Afghan rulers continued on in the ensuing years. And so we're going to take a look right now at the film clip called The Great Game.
Afghanistan, one of the most isolated, barren landscapes on Earth. It's difficult to believe that any empire would want to invade it, and yet it's become the unlikely target and obsession of some of the world's greatest empires and superpowers. In 1839, up these city walls above Kabul marched red-coated veterans of Waterloo. In 1879, Highlanders charged to the sound of the bagpipes. In 1979, Russian special forces swooped over these hills in their helicopters. And in 2001, an American-led coalition invaded Afghanistan. Each of these invasions has ended in tragedy and humiliation, and each has sparked a fierce Afghan resistance.
We have never, ever liked to be conquered.
It's really easy to get into Afghanistan. It's just the getting out part is very difficult.
Don't go into Afghanistan and get whatever you do involved in a tribal war.
Starting with the British invasions of the 19th century, how has this history forged the Afghanistan of today? By 1841, Britain's choice of ruler had proved a disaster. Once Shah Shuja was on the throne, Afghans quickly saw him as weak, as corrupt, and worst of all, as a puppet of a foreign, non-Muslim government. If you're an Afghan seeing a red-coated British soldier in the street, what would your reaction be?
Well, the Afghans saw a bunch of people in red coats, muskets on their shoulder. They do not look like them, do not talk like them, do not think like them. How they can live when they see the foreigners, the British, walking on the streets. And they are not Muslims.
Nobody really knew what was happening in Afghanistan. Optimistic British officers felt that with a bit more time and a bit more money, they were going to be able to win. And suddenly, when rumors began to spread through the tea houses and the bazaars that British officers were interfering with Afghan women, a match had been lit, which would spark an insurgency. Suddenly, up and down the country, Afghans began to feel that their culture had been insulted, that their king was only a puppet, and that they needed to fight for Afghanistan and for Islam against a foreign military occupation. Here I met up with Prince Ali Siraj, a member of the Afghan royal family, whose palace this was. People were not very pleased that a British ambassador had been put in the Bala Hissar. Why were they angry about that?
Because it reminded them of the First Anglo-Afghan War. They figured, here comes the British again, you know, and they're here to occupy Afghanistan once again. We have never, ever liked to be conquered. We have accepted poverty because we want to be free. Did not understand the Afghan psyche. They figured that they were in India and they took, you know, the East Indian Company, you know, was so successful in India. They figured, Afghanistan, rowdy people, you know, with baggy pants and turbans, you know, easy to rule, easy to control. But they forgot that Afghanistan is a nation of warriors.
I couldn't help asking him if we were making the same mistakes today.
There was an American, I will not say which organization, he came to me, he says, Prince Ali, I have received $1 billion from the United States. I said, what are you going to do with this money? He says, well, we're going to roll into the village and we're going to build things. I said, sir, if you roll into the village, they're going to roll you out. I said, you roll up to the village, then you send an emissary inside the village, talk to the elders. They will do one of two things, either invite you in or they will send somebody out to meet with you. Then once they invite you in, you sit down and you talk to them, but don't tell them what you're going to do. Ask them what they want. Respect. If you do that, you will have them in your pocket.
Afghanistan.
What Prince Ali said in that last part of the clip made a lot of sense. That is the culture. That is the way it happens over there. You don't come in to any of the Middle Eastern countries and tell them what you're going to do. You just don't. It doesn't work that way. I forgot to mention before that clip the name and status of Afghanistan. It really started in 1837 with Das Muhammad Khan's removal in 1837 when the British made it an emirate. That's the status. Essentially, they can govern themselves except for in foreign affairs or in diplomatic matters. And that's pretty much what had happened throughout that time. 1873 was something very vitally important because we're still dealing with it today. The British and the Russians, they signed an agreement January 21st, 1873, that had pretty much set the northern border of Afghanistan at the Amu Daira, which is what we had shown you on the map. That pretty much had ended. They signed the agreement, and then there was an agreement by the British and the Afghan Emir November 12th of 1893, so 20 years later, that had required Afghans to remove all troops north of the Amu Daira, and then it empowered Mortimer Durand, the Secretary of State of India, to head a bilateral commission to determine the boundary between Afghanistan and British India. And it's known as the Durand Line. It was the survey was finished in 1896. And by this time, September 10th, 1895, the great game between Russia and England was pretty much over with. Both sides had settled the Afghan-Russian border, and there was no more need for a geopolitical game between those two countries in that region anymore. So that had ended, and then we have the Durand Line. The Durand Line, it's 1,510 miles, or in the English metric system, 2,430 kilometers. The Emirate of Afghanistan, independent princely state with Britain controlling foreign affairs and diplomatic relations, but the Durand Line split the Pashtun tribal areas and the Balochistan region, and the Pashtuns and the Baloch ethnic groups were living on both sides of the border. You know, this is kind of like coming into having Canada come in and say, we're going to split the city of Stillwater in two with a big wall and a line, and you're not going to be able to see your cousin or your parents on the other side of this line. You're going to be completely cut off from them when you've been used to going into downtown Stillwater on a regular basis. We're going to set the line at Highway 36. You know, if you're on one side of 36, say the north side of 36, you're fine. But if you have relatives in Baytown Township or Bayport, you're hosed. That's kind of what the Durand Line did. And it is often called considered the most dangerous border in the world, even today. So on one side you have Afghanistan, and the other was British India, now Pakistan, and as I mentioned, they're still fighting over today. Let's take a look here at a video that explains a little bit more about the Durand Line.
Afghanistan has known many borders over the millennia, yet none have been more artificial than the one today separating Pakistan from Afghanistan, known as the Durand Line, but referred to by the military and intelligence community as Zero Line. The Durand Line was originally named after British India's Foreign Secretary, Sir Henry Mortimer Durand. In 1893, it established a boundary between British India and Afghanistan after 2 Anglo-Afghan wars and a Russian expansion that resulted in a virtual stalemate for both sides. The British and Russian empires had reached their territorial limits and wished to avoid a direct confrontation. Following over a half-century of competition for control of Central Asia, known as the Great Game, the Durand Line established Afghanistan as a neutral buffer state between rival empires. From the perspective of the Afghan Pashtuns living on both sides of the arbitrary border, the Durand Line was a horrific division of peoples who for at least 3,000 years had been considered part of the Afghan homeland. The first formulation of Afghan nationality can be traced to the 16th century. Led by Sufi poet Bayazid Ansari, his revolt against the Mughal Empire is a major chapter in the region's Pashtun history, as well as indicative of the progressive nature of Afghan Islam. Prior to British invasions of the mid-19th century, Afghans were welcoming to European visitors. They expressed an open tolerance towards Christians. East India Company political officer Alexander Burnes wrote in 1832, quote, "The people of this country are kind-hearted and hospitable. They have no prejudice against the Christian and none against our nation." This changed when 15,000 British and Indian troops attacked in 1839 in the first of 3 attempts to incorporate Afghanistan into the British Empire. Misjudging the Afghans' determination to expel the invaders, by 1841 the British occupation was doomed. The military retreat resulted in the greatest defeat in British history. Despite an official rebuke from London for the invasion, a similar mistake was repeated in 1878 when 35,000 British troops attacked again. The British attack initially appeared successful. A hasty agreement forced the Afghans to surrender districts bordering India and gave the British the authority to negotiate Afghanistan's borders and foreign policy. But by 1880, the British began to fear that history was repeating itself and invited a popular Afghan leader, Abdur Rahman Khan, to assume the throne. Known as the Iron Emir, he set the foundations for a modern Afghan state. The Emir always contended that he could control the tribes better than the British, but under protest he was forced to accept British-imposed borders. In 1893, the British Foreign Secretary for India, Sir Henry Mortimer Durand, imposed an artificial borderline between India and Afghanistan down the middle of the Hindu Kush. Following Abdur Rahman's reluctant acceptance of the Durand Line in 1893, Britain then created a threefold frontier of separation from Russia's South Asian Khanates. The conquered territory on the eastern side of the Hindu Kush Mountains was broken up into 5 tribal regions under the direct control of the British government in Delhi. The Durand Line officially deprived the Emir of land east of the Hindu Kush and of the most strategic mountain passes west of it. The line had a profound effect on the development of Afghanistan's culture and economy by cutting Afghanistan's access routes to the Arabian Sea through Baluchistan, leaving the country landlocked and dependent on the British Empire. On the British side of the border, severe penal laws known as the Frontier Crimes Regulations were reenacted in order to control the population. These laws were adapted from English laws introduced into Ireland in 1366 to stop the Anglo-Norman population from intermarrying with the native Irish. The Frontier Crimes Regulations are to this day administered by a political agent who retains absolute feudal powers as the judge, jury, police chief, warden, district magistrate, and public prosecutor.
So that should give you a little bit of an indication as to the importance of what happened in the line of separation with the Durand Line. There was a third Anglo-Afghan war from 1919 to 1926, and that ended with the Treaty of Rawalpindi, and that created the Kingdom of Afghanistan as we know it today. Prince Amanullah Khan was the head emirate since February 28, 1919, and he became the first king of Afghanistan on June 9, 1926. And then a year later, a rebellion broke out when he was visiting Europe, and he abdicated the throne in favor of his brother, who was deposed after only 3 days. That's a short rule. Mohammad Nadir, Khan's war minister, he returned from exile in India and then deposed the leader of the rebellion in 1929. Mohammad Nadir was named the king in October of 1929, just before we started our Great Depression. He was succeeded by his son, Mohammad Zahir Shah, in 1933. Now, Mohammad Zahir Shah actually has more to do with the importance of what's going on today, probably than any other figure in modern history. A few things about Mohammad Zahir Shah. He was only 19 when he took the throne in 1933. So he had two paternal uncles who really made a lot of the decisions for him. And under his leadership, Afghanistan sought relationships with the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. In 1934, they became a member of the League of Nations, and they pursued a policy of neutrality during the Second World War. So that was his rulership under his paternal uncles. You know, they were very, very cautious about trying to get anybody involved in Afghanistan, and they remembered their history. Beginning in 1963, when he was 49 years old, Zahir Shah asserted more control over his office. Well, you're almost 50 years old, you should have the power to be able to do that. And he really began the process of reform. This is key because he transformed Afghanistan into a modern democratic state. He introduced free elections. He brought in a parliament. He brought in civil rights, women's rights, including the right to vote. For somebody who is a practicing Muslim, this is pretty much a radical departure from what we see in that region today. You know, he believed in more freedom. He believed in self-rule for Afghanistan. And that's how King Zahir operated. We're going to show you real quick a clip of King Zahir celebrating Afghanistan's independence. And then also we're just going to go right into a short clip from September 5th, 1963, when Zahir met with President John F. Kennedy.
Here in Kabul, the outside world is already changing a people who, until 50 years ago, were virtually cut off from the Western world. In the bazaars, you can have your photograph taken. Jet planes now fly direct to Kabul. It was the morning of Independence Day, and King Mohammad Zahir Shah was arriving to review a march past of his national army. The Pathans are a fierce and warlike race. For years, they have terrorized the Khyber Pass and the mountains of the northwest frontier. They are the people that Kipling described so vividly in many of his novels. Afghanistan is Muslim, but many of the old customs, particularly here in Kabul, are being abandoned. Already, some of the women have discarded their veils, but you can still see both customs side by side.
A few days later, in the same streets, the Pathans celebrated their national festival in their own way. This dance alternates between slow and quickening rhythms and lasts without interruption for many hours.
Zahir Shah was the last king of Afghanistan. He had ruled from 1933, as I mentioned, up until July of 1973. He had visited Italy, and I believe Zahir Shah was getting eye surgery, if memory serves correct. And his cousin, who 10 years before was the prime minister, Mohammad Daud Khan. Zahir Shah had replaced Mohammad Daud Khan 10 years earlier, 1963, when Zahir Shah was asserting more and more influence in the affairs, and he pretty much sacked his cousin. Well, that former prime minister cousin, Mohammad Daud Khan, had staged a bloodless coup in July 1973 while Zahir Shah was in Italy. Instead of trying to fight back, he abdicated his position in August of 1974. By the way, August of 1974, that was when Richard Nixon was forced to resign. So notice I'm trying to keep you abreast with American history going throughout the history of Afghanistan. A lot of the let me try to get this right here. Mohammad Daud Khan had put an end to the monarchy. He was not going to name himself king. Instead, he named himself president. And he was put into power by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, known as the PDPA, which was established January 1st, 1965. That was the unification of different factions of the Socialist Party of Afghanistan. Very strong ties to the Soviet Union. So Mohammad Daud Khan, was essentially the puppet of the Soviet government. And that's how he ruled from 1973 for the next roughly 5 years. And then there was a split with the PDPA, and within that split became another coup. And that coup occurred 39 years ago today. Well, yesterday and today. April 27th and 28th of 1978, the PDPA launched a coup d'etat, which we now know as the Saur, S-A-U-R, revolution. And on the morning of April 28th, 1978, Mohammad Daud Khan was killed, along with his family. They were executed. And then Nur Mohammad Taraki, the former prime minister, became the new president of Afghanistan. And that's what happened leading up to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979-1980, which we will discuss at a later date. So I wanted to bring you up to date on the history of Afghanistan, going all the way back to 1747, and all of the geopolitical influences, and just a brief discussion about how Afghanistan got to the point where the Russians invaded. Keep in mind, 1978, In this time frame, things were happening in that region. We discussed it in week 1. We discussed the rise of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in Iran, Persia. We discussed the rise of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And then we have the Saur revolution in Afghanistan. So this is, these are the 3 big countries we've been fighting over. And yet, all 3 of them had leadership changes in the late 1970s, 78 and 79. Very important stuff because we're still dealing with that today. And then add the Durand Line to the mix. And so here we have a border squabble along with the regime change. So now we're going to show you a clip of Afghanistan President Taraki holding a press conference right after the Saur revolution.
Tanks loyal to young communist army officers now guard the palace where President Daud, the last of the Afghan royal family, ruled. Inside, he and his family, including his young grandchildren, were shot dead when his palace guard lost their courageous battle to defend him. The government claims they had to shoot them because they refused to surrender. Men from the different tribes who live in this backward country swarm all over tanks knocked out in the battle. They seem pleased to see the end of the old feudal regime. In the Prime Minister's house, the government has been locked in almost continuous meetings, trying to evolve a policy to bring this near-medieval civilization into the 20th century. It was 10 days before the new president, Mohammad Taraki, first appeared in public.
Our relationship, you all should be attentively heard. Our relationship with all the countries, including Soviet Union, and all our neighbors and throughout the world will be based and depend on the amount of their support to our revolutionary government in political, economical field.
Does this mean, Mr. President, that you will be following a strict policy of non-alignment?
This is quite correct.
He told the press that his government wasn't communist. Afghans are very devout Muslims. To them, communism is a godless heresy. So President Taraki can't afford to risk upsetting their religious feelings by describing his party as communist. The other problem the new government faces is that Afghans are fiercely proud of their beautiful mountainous country. When Britain ruled India, the Afghans fought 2 bitter wars to keep them out of here. And they're not going to hand over their independence now to any government which looks like surrendering to Russia. Mark Tully in Kabul.
That is where we're heading. We're heading to the cataclysmic clash between the Islamic-based people of Afghanistan versus the godless regime from the Soviet Union. I'm not going to really bring too much into this just because we've only got a couple of minutes left today. But we start seeing more of a United States influence in the region beginning after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And we're going to discuss that more next week. But this is how things got set up. And this is how empires get bogged down in Afghanistan. And the United States, because we know without shadow of a doubt we're over there, I really hope that our leaders, and I hope President Trump can actually take the time, and I'm sure that General Mattis, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, understands what's going on over there in the history in Afghanistan, and they do the right thing. Because we do not need to get bogged down. I think as we transitioned our eye on foreign policy over to Iraq instead of Afghanistan, I don't think we were fighting as much over there. We were after Osama bin Laden. He's been long since out of the picture. How do you get out of Afghanistan at the same time as you still need to do it with dignity, honor, and respect? It's a tough call. That's why we're going through the series. So yes, I know that this has been a complicated episode. It was really complicated for me to try to piece together the timeline. I thank you so much for your patience in watching this episode. I really, really do. I hope you now understand why this is vitally important. This really, really is. Our future depends on understanding what happens in this region. And as we covered last week, the rare earth elements, that's got another aspect of the geopolitics in that region. And we did cover that last week. But now, as we understand the history of the Afghan people, we look at the history of Afghan conquest. We look at the great game between Russia and Britain. It's been a mess. But the Afghan people themselves still like freedom. Prince Ali got it right. We'll live in poverty before we give up our freedom. I don't know of too many people in America who would want to go in poverty to keep their freedom. I mean, I challenge anybody to take away their iPhone 7. You got to live your life without an iPhone 7. Oh my, I got to have my phone. Try going a week without the internet. I couldn't do that. You know, in Afghanistan, they're perfectly content. In a region of the world that looks a lot like the western United States. Some parts of Afghanistan look a lot like the deserts of New Mexico and Nevada. Other parts are the mountainous, rocky mountains of Colorado, stretching up to Montana. That's what Afghanistan looks like, but they're a very proud people. So with that, we are actually going to play our musical exit number. And today we are going to play the national anthem of Afghanistan, but this is going to be from 1926 to 1943. And I'm going to apologize because this is either one of the old cylinder type recordings or one of the phonographs. You get scratchiness in the grooves. This is an old record, but we're going to be playing it for you to make sure, just as our way of paying tribute to the Afghan people prior to a communist regime. Dallas Pearson, producer. I'm Jeff Williams, host. You're watching North Star Oasis, reminding you that we have 240 shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.